The winter wind cut through the streets of Millbrook Falls like a blade on February 18, 1973. Snow clung to the bare branches of oak trees that lined Maple Street, their skeletal fingers reaching toward a gray sky that promised more of the same bitter cold. It was the kind of Sunday morning that made even the most devout churchgoers consider staying home by the fire. But not the Hartwell family. Never the Hartwell family. Thomas Hartwell had been the kind of man who believed punctuality was next to godliness. At 52, he wore his faith-like armor, his steel gray hair always perfectly combed, his Sunday suits pressed to military precision. His wife, Margaret, 48 years old with gentle brown eyes and hands that still smelled of the fresh bread she baked every Saturday night, had never missed a service in the 23 years they'd been married. Their children, 16-year-old Rebecca and 12-year-old Daniel, had grown up knowing that Sunday morning meant one thing. The family would be in their usual pew at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church by exactly 9:45 a.m. The church itself stood like a Gothic sentinel at the corner of Elm and 3rd, its red brick facade weathered by decades of harsh Minnesota winters. Built in 1889, St. Andrew's had served the small community of Millbrook Falls through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and countless personal tragedies and triumphs. The congregation of roughly 200 souls knew each other's business, each other's struggles, and each other's sins. It was the kind of place where everyone noticed when someone was absent, where empty pews spoke as loudly as filled ones. That Sunday morning, as the congregation began filtering in through the heavy wooden doors, Pastor Edmund Whitmore noticed something unusual. The 3rd pew from the front on the left side, the one where the Hartwell family had sat every Sunday for over 2 decades, remained conspicuously empty. By 9:50, when the organ began its opening hymn, that pew still sat vacant. Pastor Whitmore, a thin man in his early 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, found his gaze drifting to that empty space throughout the service. Thomas Hartwell served on the church board, helped count the collection money, and had never been late, let alone absent, without calling ahead. Something felt wrong, though the pastor couldn't quite put his finger on what. After the service, as congregation members filed past to shake his hand and exchange pleasantries about the weather and their plans for the week, Pastor Whitmore pulled aside Eleanor Morrison, an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down from the Hartwells on Maple Street. "Eleanor," he said quietly, his voice carrying just the hint of concern that would later prove prophetic. "Did you happen to see the Hartwells this morning?" Thomas mentioned staying late after last Wednesday's board meeting to discuss the new furnace fund, but I haven't spoken to them since. Eleanor Morrison, 71 years old with sharp eyes that missed nothing in their neighborhood, shook her head slowly. "Now that you mention it, Pastor, I don't believe I have seen hide nor hair of any of them since yesterday afternoon. Margaret was hanging laundry on the line around 3 o'clock. I remember because I was watching my stories on the television and happened to glance out the kitchen window. But their house was dark when I went to bed last night, and it was still dark this morning when I left for church." The first seeds of unease began to take root in Pastor Whitmore's mind. The Hartwells were creatures of habit, predictable as clockwork. Thomas would be outside shoveling the walk by 7 a.m. every Sunday. Margaret would have the kitchen lights on by 6:30 as she prepared breakfast, and the children would be visible through the front windows getting ready for church. For their house to be dark on a Sunday morning was as unusual as snow in July. Perhaps they had a family emergency, Pastor Whitmore suggested, though his voice carried little conviction. Maybe someone fell ill during the night, or they received word about a relative. But even as he spoke the words, they felt hollow. Thomas Hartwell was the type of man who would have called the church, left a message with someone, made sure his absence was explained. He took his responsibilities seriously, perhaps too seriously according to some in the congregation who found his rigid adherence to protocol occasionally irritating. Eleanor Morrison's weathered face creased with worry. "I suppose I could walk over after I get home, see if anyone answers the door. Maybe bring them some of that chicken soup I made yesterday, in case someone is feeling poorly." The two parted ways in the church parking lot, Eleanor walking slowly toward Maple Street while Pastor Whitmore climbed into his aging Ford pickup truck. Neither could have imagined that within hours their quiet Sunday afternoon would transform into something that would haunt Millbrook Falls for decades to come. Eleanor Morrison reached the Hartwell house at approximately 1:15 p.m. The two-story colonial sat silent behind a white picket fence that Thomas had painted just the previous summer. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the bitter cold. No lights glowed behind the curtained windows. The family's blue 1971 Chevrolet Malibu sat in the driveway, its windshield covered with a thin layer of snow that suggested it hadn't been moved since the previous evening. She knocked first on the front door, then waited. No footsteps, no voices, no sounds of life from within. She tried the doorbell, listening to its cheerful chime echo through what seemed like an empty house. Growing more concerned, Eleanor walked around to the back door and knocked again. Still nothing. Manchu. It was then that she noticed something that would later prove significant. The back door stood slightly ajar, perhaps 2 inches, as if someone had closed it hastily without ensuring the latch caught properly. A thin line of snow had blown inside, creating a small drift on the kitchen floor visible through the gap. Eleanor Morrison had lived through the Depression, had raised 4 children, and possessed the kind of practical courage that comes from surviving 7 decades of life's uncertainties. But something about that partially open door, about the absolute silence emanating from a house that should have been filled with the warm sounds of Sunday afternoon family life, made her step back from the threshold. Instead, she hurried next door to the Peterson house and asked them to call the police. Sheriff Deputy Jake Sullivan arrived at the Hartwell house at 2:05 p.m., driving the county's single patrol car with its distinctive brown and gold paint scheme. At 34 years old, Sullivan had been with the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department for 8 years. There's long enough to know that most missing persons cases involved teenagers staying out past curfew or elderly residents wandering off and getting confused. He expected to find the Hartwell family had simply gone to visit relatives and forgotten to mention it to anyone. What he found instead would change his life forever. Deputy Sullivan began with the obvious, knocking loudly on both the front and back doors, identifying himself as law enforcement, calling out for any occupants to respond. When the silence continued, he used the radio in his patrol car to contact Sheriff William Hayes, explaining the situation and requesting permission to enter the residence for a welfare check. Sheriff Hayes, a man who had served Millbrook County for over 20 years and had seen his share of winter tragedies, authorized the entry. Rural Minnesota winters could be deadly: carbon monoxide leaks from faulty furnaces, house fires from overloaded electrical systems, and medical emergencies that struck without warning. Better to check and find nothing than to wait and discover a preventable tragedy. Deputy Sullivan entered through the unlocked back door at 2:23 p.m. The kitchen appeared normal at first glance. Clean dishes sat in the drying rack beside the sink. A loaf of homemade bread, Margaret's famous Sunday bread that she baked every Saturday night, sat wrapped in a tea towel on the counter. The coffee pot contained cold coffee, as if someone had made a pot earlier and forgotten about it. Nothing seemed disturbed or out of place. But there were subtle signs that something wasn't right. A chair at the kitchen table sat pulled out at an odd angle, as if someone had risen from it quickly. And the salt and pepper shakers, which Margaret always kept precisely centered on the table, sat pushed to one side. Most strangely, 4 coffee cups sat on the counter, apparently unused, as if someone had been preparing to serve coffee to guests who never arrived. Deputy Sullivan called out again, his voice echoing through the quiet house. "This is the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. Is anyone home? We are here to check on your welfare." Only silence answered. He moved methodically through the house, his footsteps creaking on the old wooden floors. The living room looked exactly as it should on a Sunday afternoon, newspapers folded neatly on the coffee table, Thomas's reading glasses sitting beside his favorite chair, and Margaret's knitting basket containing a half-finished scarf in soft blue wool. The television was turned off, which struck Sullivan as slightly unusual, since most families would have it on for the Sunday afternoon programming. Upstairs, the bedrooms told a more puzzling story. The master bedroom appeared lived in but neat, the bed made with military precision in Thomas's characteristic style. Rebecca's room showed the typical organized chaos of a 16-year-old girl, school books stacked on the desk, a few items of clothing draped over the chair, teen magazine photos of popular musicians taped to the mirror. Daniel's room reflected his 12-year-old interests, model airplanes hanging from the ceiling, baseball cards in neat stacks. A partially completed jigsaw puzzle spread across a card table. But in each bedroom, certain items were conspicuously absent. No coats hung in the closets, though Minnesota February demanded heavy winter wear. No shoes sat beside the beds, though the family would certainly have removed their boots upon entering the house. Most tellingly, the bathroom showed no signs of morning routines, no damp towels, no displaced toiletries, no evidence that 4 people had gotten ready for church that morning. Deputy Sullivan found himself standing in the hallway between the bedrooms, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It appeared that the family had left the house, but not for church. They had dressed warmly and taken their shoes, but had left behind the blue Chevrolet that sat in the driveway. Most puzzling of all, they seemed to have left in a hurry, without finishing their coffee or properly securing the back door. The basement revealed nothing unusual. A typical 1950s cellar with a furnace that hummed normally, the shelves lined with Margaret's canned vegetables from the previous summer's garden, and Thomas's workbench where he repaired household items and pursued his hobby of building small wooden furniture pieces. By 3:15 p.m., Deputy Sullivan had searched every room, every closet, every possible hiding place in the house. The Hartwell family was simply gone, vanished as if they had stepped out of their lives between Saturday evening and Sunday morning, leaving behind only the mysterious evidence of an interrupted routine and 4 unused coffee cups. He radioed Sheriff Hayes with his findings, his voice betraying the first hints of the unease that would soon consume everyone connected to the case. "Sheriff, this is Sullivan at the Hartwell residence. The family isn't here, but something's not right. Looks like they left in a hurry, maybe sometime last night or early this morning. Their car's still here. But they took their coats and shoes, request backup, and maybe someone who can dust for prints." Sheriff Hayes's voice crackled through the radio with the authority of a man accustomed to taking charge in crisis situations. "Understood, Jake. Don't touch anything else. I'm sending Morrison and the camera equipment. Start a log of everything you have observed, and I will contact the State Bureau of Investigation. If this family is genuinely missing, we need to handle it by the book from minute 1. As Deputy Sullivan began documenting his observations in the small notebook he always carried, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The house held an almost expectant silence, as if waiting for its occupants to return at any moment. Yet something in that silence felt permanent, final, like the quiet that settles over a place where life has ended rather than merely paused. At 4:07 p.m., Detective Ray Morrison arrived with the county's aging camera equipment and evidence collection kit. Morrison, a 45-year-old veteran who had transferred to Millbrook County from Minneapolis to escape the growing violence of urban police work, brought a methodical approach that would prove crucial in the days ahead. "Walk me through it," Morrison said simply, pulling on latex gloves and preparing his camera. Deputy Sullivan recounted his observations room by room, watching as Morrison photographed everything: the angled chair, the displaced salt and pepper shakers, the unused coffee cups, the empty coat closets, the made beds, the open back door. Each photograph captured not just physical evidence, but the growing mystery of a family that seemed to have vanished mid-routine. "What's your gut telling you, Jake?" Morrison asked as they stood in the kitchen, both men staring at those 4 unused coffee cups that seemed to mock them with their ordinary presence in an increasingly extraordinary situation. Sullivan considered the question carefully. 8 years of police work had taught him to trust his instincts while never abandoning logic. "My gut says they didn't leave willingly, Ray. Everything about this family screams routine, predictability, planning ahead. Thomas Hartwell doesn't strike me as the type to spontaneously pack up his family and disappear on a Sunday morning without telling anyone. And if they were planning to leave town, why not take the car? if there was an emergency that required them to leave immediately. Why take time to make coffee and then not drink it? Morrison nodded, photographing the coffee cups from multiple angles. Any sign of struggle? Forced entry? Blood? Nothing obvious. No broken locks, no damaged doors or windows, no overturned furniture. If someone took them, it was either someone they knew and trusted, or someone professional enough not to leave obvious signs. The two officers continued their methodical documentation as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow-covered yard. With each photograph, each measurement, each carefully noted observation, the mystery deepened rather than clarified. They were gathering evidence of an absence, documenting the negative space where a family should have been. At 5:30 p.m., Sheriff Hayes arrived to assess the situation personally. A big man with gray hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent dealing with human nature at its worst and best. Hayes had handled missing persons cases before. But something about the Hartwell disappearance felt different from the start. Any word from hospitals, relatives, friends? He asked Morrison and Sullivan as they stood in the eerily quiet living room. I have contacted Hennepin General, St. Mary's, and the University Hospital in Minneapolis, Sullivan reported. No John or Jane Does matching their descriptions brought in during the last 48 hours. And Pastor Whitmore is checking with other congregation members to see if anyone knows about relatives they might have gone to visit. So far, nothing. Sheriff Hayes examined the evidence they had gathered with the careful attention of a man who understood that first impressions often proved crucial in investigations. The unused coffee cups particularly troubled him. In his experience, people who were planning to leave somewhere typically didn't begin preparing refreshments they had no intention of consuming. Here's what we know for certain, Hayes said, his voice carrying the authority that came from 2 decades of separating facts from speculation. The Hartwell family was seen alive and well yesterday afternoon. They didn't attend church this morning, which is completely out of character. They appear to have left their house sometime between yesterday evening and this morning, taking their winter clothing but leaving their car. The house shows signs of interrupted routine, but no obvious signs of struggle or forced entry. He paused, looking around the comfortable living room with its family photographs and evidence of ordinary, peaceful lives suddenly disrupted. Here's what we don't know, and what we need to find out fast: where they went, why they left, whether they left voluntarily, and whether they are in danger. Morrison, I want you to start interviewing neighbors, beginning with Eleanor Morrison and expanding out in a grid pattern. Someone must have seen or heard something. Sullivan, work with Pastor Whitmore to compile a list of every friend, relative, and acquaintance this family had. Start making phone calls. As the 3 officers prepared to expand their investigation, none of them could have anticipated that they were beginning a case that would consume hundreds of man-hours, generate thousands of pages of reports, and ultimately raise more questions than it answered. The Hartwell family had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the echo of their normal lives and the growing certainty that something terrible had happened in the quiet hours between Saturday night and Sunday morning. The sun was setting behind the bare oak trees on Maple Street, casting long shadows across the snow-covered yard of the Hartwell house. Inside, Detective Morrison continued photographing and documenting, creating a record of absence that would be studied and analyzed for years to come. Outside, Deputy Sullivan began the painstaking process of canvassing neighbors, hoping that someone had seen something, anything. That might explain how 4 people could simply cease to exist between the time Margaret hung laundry on the line and the time Eleanor Morrison discovered their empty house. What none of them knew as they worked methodically through their investigative protocols in the growing darkness of that February evening was that the Hartwell family's disappearance was only the beginning. Within 72 hours, their investigation would take a turn that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the quiet, God-fearing community of Millbrook Falls, and force them to confront possibilities that existed far beyond the boundaries of conventional police work. The empty coffee cups sat on the kitchen counter, waiting for answers that might never come. The discovery that would shatter every assumption about the Hartwell disappearance came not from methodical police work, but from an unlikely source, A 12-year-old Timothy Fletcher, who lived 4 blocks away from the missing family and possessed the kind of restless curiosity that adults often found troublesome. 3 days after Deputy Sullivan had first entered the silent Hartwell house, Timothy was exploring the abandoned Grayson Mill on the outskirts of Millbrook Falls. The old flour mill had closed in 1967, its machinery sold off and its windows boarded up, leaving behind only the skeletal remains of what had once been the town's economic heartbeat. Local teenagers occasionally used the property for illicit activities, but on this bitter Wednesday afternoon in February, Timothy had the place to himself. He was searching for interesting pieces of old machinery to add to his collection of mechanical curiosities when he noticed something that made him stop dead in his tracks. In the snow behind the mill, partially hidden by a collapsed section of wooden fence, sat a familiar blue sedan, Thomas Hartwell's 1971 Chevrolet Malibu. Timothy Fletcher, despite his youth, possessed enough sense to understand that this discovery was significant. The entire town had been buzzing with rumors about the missing family for 3 days. He had heard his parents whispering about search parties and state police involvement. Finding the Hartwell car hidden behind an abandoned mill was clearly something the authorities needed to know about immediately. 20 minutes later, Sheriff Hayes stood in the snow beside the blue Chevrolet, his weathered face grim as he examined what Timothy Fletcher had stumbled upon. The car sat at an angle, as if it had been driven hastily into the concealment of the collapsed fence and abandoned there. Snow had drifted against its sides, but not enough to completely obscure it from view. Someone familiar with the area could have easily spotted it if they had been looking. Detective Morrison arrived within minutes, bringing his camera and evidence collection kit. Deputy Sullivan followed shortly after, having been pulled from his systematic canvassing of Maple Street neighbors. All 3 officers approached the vehicle with the careful attention of men who understood they might be looking at a crime scene. The car doors were unlocked, which immediately struck Sheriff Hayes as suspicious. Thomas Hartwell had been the type of man who locked his car doors religiously, even when parked in his own driveway. Leaving the vehicle unlocked in an abandoned location suggested either panic or the work of someone unfamiliar with Thomas's habits. Morrison began photographing the exterior of the vehicle from every conceivable angle while Sheriff Hayes peered through the windows, careful not to disturb any potential evidence. What he saw inside made his stomach tighten with the kind of dread that came from 20 years of witnessing human tragedy. 4 coffee cups sat on the dashboard, arranged in a neat row. The same 4 unused coffee cups they had found in the Hartwell kitchen 3 days earlier. Sheriff Hayes called to Detective Morrison, his voice carefully controlled. "When you are finished with the exterior shots, I need you to document the interior before we open any doors. We have got those coffee cups from the house, sitting right there on the dashboard like some kind of calling card." Morrison lowered his camera, following Hayes's gaze through the windshield. The sight of those 4 coffee cups, transported from the family kitchen to this abandoned location, transformed the case from a missing persons investigation into something far more sinister. Someone had deliberately moved those cups, placed them in the car, and driven the vehicle to this concealed location. The act suggested planning, forethought, and a disturbing attention to psychological detail. "Sheriff," Deputy Sullivan said quietly, "if someone moved the car here after the family disappeared, why not just leave it in the driveway? Why go to the trouble of hiding it, then arrange those cups like some kind of message?" It was a question that would haunt the investigation for years to come. The placement of the coffee cups seemed almost theatrical, as if whoever had moved them wanted to ensure they would be found and recognized. But what message were they intended to convey? And why go to such elaborate lengths to communicate it? Detective Morrison spent 45 minutes photographing the vehicle's interior through the windows before Sheriff Hayes authorized opening the doors. When they finally gained access to the car's interior, they discovered details that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The car keys sat in the ignition, turned to the off position but still inserted in the lock. Thomas Hartwell's wallet lay on the passenger seat, containing $63 in cash and all of his identification. Margaret's purse sat on the floor behind the driver's seat, apparently undisturbed, with her own wallet, keys, and personal items intact. Most disturbing of all, 4 sets of winter clothing lay folded neatly in the back seat. Thomas's heavy wool coat, Margaret's blue winter jacket, Rebecca's red parka, and Daniel's brown winter coat. The same coats that had been missing from the closets in the family home. They left the house wearing these coats, Sheriff Hayes said, examining the clothing without touching it. Someone brought them here, removed the coats, folded them neatly, and left them in the car along with everything else. But where are the people who were wearing them? The question hung in the cold February air like a physical presence. Someone had transported the Hartwell family from their home to this location, removed their winter clothing in sub-freezing temperatures, and then made them disappear completely. The methodical nature of the crime, the careful arrangement of evidence, suggested a perpetrator who wanted the discovery to unfold in exactly this manner. Detective Morrison continued documenting every detail of the car's interior while Sheriff Hayes used his radio to contact the State Bureau of Investigation. This case had moved far beyond the capabilities of a small county sheriff's department. They needed forensic specialists, fingerprint experts, and investigators with experience in complex disappearances. "This is Sheriff Hayes in Millbrook County," he said into the radio microphone. "I need to speak with Agent Patterson immediately. We have got 4 missing persons, and this case just became a probable homicide investigation." The response came within an hour. Agent Linda Patterson of the Minnesota State Bureau of Investigation would arrive the following morning with a full forensic team. Until then, Sheriff Hayes ordered the scene secured and maintained under 24-hour guard. No one was to approach the vehicle or the surrounding area without authorization. As evening approached and temporary floodlights were set up around the abandoned mill, and the 3 local officers stood in the snow discussing the implications of what they had discovered. The Hartwell family had not simply disappeared. They had been taken, transported to this location, and then removed to some unknown destination while their possessions were arranged as evidence for investigators to find. "Whoever did this wanted us to find the car," Detective Morrison observed, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "They could have dumped it anywhere, pushed it into the river, hidden it in the woods where it might not be discovered for months. Instead, they put it somewhere that a curious kid would eventually stumble across it, and they arranged everything inside like a museum display." But Sheriff Hayes nodded grimly. "The question is whether they wanted us to find it now, or whether they planned for it to be discovered later. And what happens next? Are we going to find more evidence arranged for us to discover, or was this the final act?" The answer came sooner than any of them expected. Agent Patterson arrived Thursday morning with a team of 6 specialists and enough equipment to conduct a thorough forensic examination of both the vehicle and the surrounding area. The surrounding area? On a tall woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intense focus that came from years of investigating humanity's darkest impulses. Patterson took one look at the arranged evidence and immediately understood they were dealing with something far more complex than a typical missing persons case. "This is staged," she announced after examining the coffee cups and folded clothing. "Someone wants us to see this, wants us to know that they have the family, and wants us to understand that they are in complete control of the situation. The question is what they want from us in return." Patterson's team spent the entire day processing the scene. They dusted every surface of the car for fingerprints, collected fiber samples from the clothing, tested for blood evidence, and used metal detectors to search the surrounding area for any additional clues. They found nothing that identified the perpetrator, but they did discover something that made the case even more disturbing. Buried in the snow approximately 50 feet from where the car had been hidden, one of the forensic specialists found a small wooden cross, the kind typically given to children in Sunday school. Carved into its surface was a single word, "Saved." Agent Patterson held the cross in her gloved hand, studying its simple construction and crude carving. The wood appeared to be pine, probably carved with a basic pocket knife, and the word "saved." It had been burned into the surface with what looked like a wood-burning tool, the kind used for crafts and hobby projects. "Religious motivation," she said to Sheriff Hayes. "Someone took this family for reasons connected to their faith, their church attendance, something about their spiritual life." The cross isn't accidental, it's part of the message. The discovery of the cross prompted Agent Patterson to expand the investigation in a new direction. If the Hartwell disappearance was religiously motivated, then other church-going families in the area might be at risk. She ordered increased patrols around St. Andrew's Episcopal Church and requested that Pastor Whitmore provide a complete list of all congregation members and their families. Pastor Whitmore, when presented with this request Thursday evening, appeared genuinely shaken by the implications. Agent Patterson, he said, his voice trembling slightly, I have served this congregation for 15 years. I know these people, their families, their children. The idea that someone would target them because of their faith, because they come to worship on Sunday mornings, is almost incomprehensible to me. But Agent Patterson had seen too much human evil to find any crime truly incomprehensible. Pastor, I need you to think carefully about anyone who might have had a grudge against the church, against your congregation, or against the Hartwell family specifically. Someone who was angry about religious issues, someone who felt excluded or rejected. Someone who might view regular churchgoers as targets for some kind of twisted salvation. Pastor Whitmore spent that evening reviewing his mental catalogue of everyone who had interacted with St. Andrew's Episcopal Church during his tenure. He thought about former members who had left under difficult circumstances, individuals who had requested help that the church couldn't provide, people who had expressed anger or resentment about religious matters. One name kept surfacing in his thoughts, though he hesitated to mention it to the authorities without more substantial reasons for suspicion. Marcus Thorne had been a member of the congregation for approximately 2 years, from 1970 to 1972. A man in his mid-30s who had moved to Millbrook Falls from Minneapolis, claiming to seek a quieter, more spiritual life away from urban corruption. He had attended services regularly, participated in Bible study groups, and volunteered for various church activities. But there had been something unsettling about his intensity, his tendency to interpret Scripture in ways that made other congregation members uncomfortable. The breaking point had come during a heated discussion in Bible study about salvation and divine judgment. Thorne had argued that most people who claimed to be Christians were actually hypocrites destined for damnation, and that true believers had a responsibility to help save souls through whatever means necessary. When other group members disagreed with his increasingly extreme interpretations, Thorne had become agitated, accusing them of spiritual blindness and moral weakness. Pastor Whitmore had attempted to counsel Thorne privately, but their conversations had only revealed deeper problems. Thorne seemed to believe that he had been chosen by God for some special purpose, that he possessed unique insights into divine will, and that conventional church teachings were inadequate for truly dedicated believers. When Pastor Whitmore gently suggested that Thorne might benefit from speaking with a professional counselor, the man had exploded in anger, accusing the pastor of being a false teacher leading his flock astray. Thorne had stopped attending services in late 1972, but not before making several disturbing statements about the need to separate the wheat from the chaff and show people what real salvation looks like. Pastor Whitmore had been relieved when the man simply disappeared from the congregation, assuming he had moved away or found another church more compatible with his extreme views. Now, sitting in his study Thursday night and trying to remember every detail about Marcus Thorne, Pastor Whitmore felt a growing certainty that he needed to share this information with Agent Patterson immediately. Friday morning brought a break in the case that no one had anticipated. Agent Patterson received Thorne's name from Pastor Whitmore at 8 a.m., and by 10 a.m. her team had located his current address. A small farmhouse 12 miles outside Millbrook Falls, isolated on 40 acres of unproductive land that he had purchased for cash in January 1973. The timing was suspicious enough to warrant immediate investigation. Thorne had bought the property just weeks before the Hartwell family disappeared, paying the full purchase price in cash despite having no apparent source of significant income. Agent Patterson assembled a team consisting of herself, Sheriff Hayes, Detective Morrison, Deputy Sullivan, and 2 additional state investigators for what she hoped would be a routine interview with a potential witness. What they found at Marcus Thorne's farmhouse would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. The property sat at the end of a long, rutted dirt road, surrounded by bare fields and skeletal trees that provided no concealment for anyone approaching the house. Thorne's farmhouse was a modest two-story structure that appeared to be in good repair, with smoke rising from the chimney and a single light visible in what looked like the kitchen window. Agent Patterson's team approached carefully, following standard protocols for potentially dangerous situations. They parked their vehicles at the top of the driveway and walked the final 100 yards to the house, maintaining tactical positions and keeping communication equipment ready. Agent Patterson knocked on the front door, while the other officers positioned themselves around the property. "Mr. Thorne, this is Agent Patterson with the Minnesota State Bureau of Investigation. We'd like to speak with you about a missing persons case we are investigating." And the door opened immediately, as if Thorne had been waiting for them. The man who stood in the doorway matched Pastor Whitmore's description: mid-30s, average height, brown hair, unremarkable features that would be easy to forget in a crowd. But his eyes held an intensity that made Agent Patterson instinctively reach for her weapon. "I have been expecting you," Marcus Thorne said calmly. "Please come inside. I believe you will find what you are looking for." The interior of the farmhouse appeared normal at first glance: simple furniture, clean surfaces, evidence of a solitary but organized life. Thorne led them through the living room toward the kitchen, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times. "The Hartwell family," Agent Patterson said, studying Thorne's face for any reaction. "Do you know what happened to them?" Thorne smiled, an expression that contained no warmth or human recognition. "They have been saved," he said simply, "just as the others will be saved when their time comes." Agent Patterson felt her blood chill as the implications of Thorne's statement became clear. "What others, Mr. Thorne? Where are the Hartwells?" Instead of answering directly, Thorne gestured toward a door that appeared to lead to the basement. "They are waiting for you downstairs." "They have been waiting since Sunday morning, actually. I told them someone would come eventually to witness what true salvation looks like." Sheriff Hayes and Detective Morrison exchanged glances that communicated volumes without words. They were standing in the presence of someone who had committed acts beyond normal comprehension, someone who spoke about murder and kidnapping as if discussing routine household chores. "Mr. Thorne," Agent Patterson said carefully, "I need you to step away from that door and put your hands where I can see them." But Thorne was already moving, not toward the basement door, but toward the kitchen window. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising with religious fervor. "They chose to be saved. When I explained to them what was happening, when I showed them the truth about their false worship and empty rituals, they accepted their salvation gratefully." Agent Patterson drew her weapon as Thorne reached the window and looked out at the barren fields surrounding his property. "The others are out there," he said, pointing toward a section of woods approximately 200 yards from the house. 17 souls I have helped find their way to true salvation over the past 3 years. The Hartwells were just the most recent." The confession hit the assembled officers like a physical blow. They had been investigating the disappearance of one family, but Thorne was claiming responsibility for 17 previous murders spanning 3 years. The isolated farmhouse, purchased with cash just before the Hartwells vanished, had been the location of a killing spree that no one had even realized was happening. "Where exactly are the Hartwells, Mr. Thorne?" Agent Patterson demanded, keeping her weapon trained on the man who stood calmly by the kitchen window. Thorne turned back toward them, his face displaying the kind of peaceful expression typically associated with religious ecstasy. "In the basement," he said, "exactly where I promised they would be. They are waiting for you to see what real faith looks like." The next 30 minutes would test every assumption the officers held about human nature and the limits of evil. Agent Patterson coordinated with backup units while Sheriff Hayes and Detective Morrison secured Marcus Thorne in handcuffs. The basement door stood before them like a gateway to horrors they could barely imagine. When they finally descended the wooden stairs into the farmhouse basement, they discovered a scene that would require months of therapy for every officer present to process. The basement had been converted into what could only be described as a chapel of death, complete with makeshift pews, a crude altar, and religious symbols carved into every available surface. 4 bodies sat in the front pew, dressed in their Sunday finest, positioned as if attending a worship service that would last for eternity. Thomas, Margaret, Rebecca, and Daniel Hartwell had been arranged with meticulous care, their faces peaceful, their hands folded in prayer, their bodies showing no signs of violence or struggle. But it was not just the Hartwells. The basement contained 17 other bodies, all positioned in similar fashion, all dressed in their best clothes, all appearing to have died without violence. Men, women, and children from across the region, people who had disappeared over the past 3 years and been presumed to have moved away, run off, or met with accidents. Agent Patterson would later describe the scene as the most disturbing crime scene in Minnesota history. Not because of violence or gore, but because of the terrible care with which Marcus Thorne had arranged his victims, the religious devotion he had brought to systematic murder, and the peaceful expressions on faces of people who had somehow been convinced to accept their own deaths. The investigation that followed would reveal that Thorne had been using a combination of drugs and psychological manipulation to convince his victims that death was their path to salvation. He had targeted religious families, individuals he deemed false Christians, who needed to be shown the truth about divine judgment. The 4 coffee cups found in the Hartwell house and car had been part of his method, drugged beverages that rendered victims compliant while he transported them to his basement chapel. Marcus Thorne confessed to everything, showing no remorse and expressing genuine bewilderment that the authorities didn't appreciate the spiritual service he had been providing. He spent his remaining years in a maximum security psychiatric facility, where he died in 1978, still convinced that he had been doing God's work. The Hartwell family was buried together on a hillside overlooking Millbrook Falls, their funeral attended by the entire community and hundreds of people from neighboring towns. St. Andrew's Episcopal Church installed a memorial plaque in the 3rd pew from the front, where the family had sat every Sunday for over 20 years. But questions lingered long after the case was officially closed. How had 17 people disappeared over 3 years without anyone noticing a pattern? How had Marcus Thorne convinced entire families to drink poisoned coffee and accept their deaths as salvation? And most disturbing of all, how many other Marcus Thornes were out there, hiding in plain sight among normal, God-fearing communities, waiting for their opportunity to provide their own twisted version of salvation? The empty pew at St. Andrew's stands as a reminder that evil often wears the mask of righteousness, and that the most dangerous predators are those who convince themselves they are acting in service of a higher power. Every Sunday morning, as the congregation gathers for worship, they remember the Hartwell family and the 17 other souls who believed they were attending a service that would bring them closer to God. Instead, they found only darkness, arranged with terrible care in the basement of a farmhouse where salvation had become synonymous with death. The case file remains open, not because there are unresolved questions about what happened, but because somewhere in America, other Marcus Thornes are probably preparing their own chapels, selecting their own victims, and preparing to offer their own version of salvation to families who will never see another Sunday morning. The coffee cups sit in evidence storage, silent witnesses to the terrible human capacity for evil disguised as righteousness.